Thank you, Suming. And Linda Jacobson's not here, but I'd also like to express my thanks to her and to China Matters. It's an organisation that plays an important role in generating discussion and publicly tossing around ideas to discuss and to potentially solve some of those big issues. So I really appreciate this invitation. It's kind of rare for a journalist to be giving an address. It's a bit like doing TV, but you can see the audience. So it's kind of a bit out of my comfort zone here. As Suming just said, I've been asked to speak tonight primarily about the media's role in our perceptions of China and its role in Chinese perceptions of Australia, because of course I've just come back from Beijing last year. But I'm also going to talk about my personal involvement with China, which goes back to about 2008, just before the Beijing Olympics. So like a lot of young-ish people who have China-related careers, I first took an interest in China during the sort of golden era of Australia-China ties. This is sort of around about 2007 when Kevin Rudd was the opposition leader and the Beijing Olympics were on the horizon. Now, watching Kevin Rudd bust out a bit of Mandarin on telly, I thought I should give this language a go. He looked like a pretty busy guy, but he seemed to be able to speak it. So I thought maybe if I tried, I might be able to get to some sort of level where I could use it as a party trick or something. It was also a time when the mining boom was in full flight, and with the Olympics coming up, it just sort of seemed like China was the inevitable future. So I ended up studying in Beijing for a few months in 2008. And it was pre-Olympics. The city was in an absolute frenzy of change and upheaval. And it was really exciting. It was so exciting to be there. So I only did a couple of months, but I resolved to find a way to come back to China and spend a bit more time there. So in 2010, I returned to China initially to study the language full-time, but I wanted to find a way to stay longer. And I didn't want to teach kids English. So I decided to take a job at China's most important state media outlet, the Xinhua news agency. Now, you might be familiar with the backstory of Xinhua. It sort of started life as the red news agency of Mao's communists, and it became the official news agency of the PRC once the communists won the civil war in 1989. And to this day, it pretty much remains in that role. I mean, it's a lot bigger now, and it's sort of like all Chinese state media, it's all over Western social media, but it is still the official organ of the state. So I was about 24 or 25, and I took a job as a foreign expert, which means I was an expert in speaking my own language. Not really a very high bar. But it got me a one-year work visa and some very valuable insights into the strengths and weaknesses of China's state-run media outlets. So on the first day that I turned up, a senior editor took me around and she introduced me to all my new colleagues. And, they're all very polite. They'd seen a lot of these foreign experts come and go. But I shook hands with a young woman who said, "Nice to meet you." And then straight away she said, "Hey, I've got a question. Why is the Western media so negative towards China?" It sort of struck me as a bit rude. I just met her and it was my first day in the office, but it didn't seem to strike her as rude. Anyway, I sort of brushed it off. Literally 2 or 3 colleagues later, I got the exact same question, and then I got it again a third time. And so clearly this was something on the minds of journalists at Xinhua back then. Because in 2008, the Olympics were still pretty fresh. And the jarring contrast between the scenes of protesters at the torch relay overseas and the scenes of pure celebration on state TV in China, that was still pretty fresh as well. So some people online, somewhat backed by the state media, but these were sort of people genuinely just pissed off, they sort of got online and they started to pick apart mistakes and assumptions in Western media coverage of China, not just about the torch relay, but more generally. And this narrative didn't come out of nowhere. There were plenty of mistakes and assumptions to seize upon. And there was also this perception gap between daily life in cities like Shanghai and Beijing and what you see in the perception or the portrayal of China in the international media at the time. So, for example, the first time I stayed in Beijing in 2008, I remember this really clearly. Back then, air pollution was a pretty big problem, but you'd sort of get, 2 days of really bad smog each week, and then you might get 3 or 4 days of kind of smoggy weather, but it's okay. And then you get 1 or 2 really clear blue sky days. And I remember there was this run of about 3 or 4 of these blue sky days consecutively. And everyone was just so bloody happy about it. Everyone felt great. They were going outside. The Beijingers were putting so much effort into preparing their city to welcome the world, to have this big celebration. They'd put in so much effort. And so I'm staying in like a university dorm. So it's one of these places that foreigners live. And so it has the BBC. Because the BBC's basically been banned in China, but you could get it in foreigner-friendly accommodation or high-end hotels. So I'm watching the BBC, and they got a correspondent at the time in 2008 in Beijing. And I turn it on, and he's standing there on the most polluted day possible. And, he's standing there saying, "With air quality like this, it's no surprise that many athletes are fearful about coming to Beijing for the games." And I'm like, I'm looking out the window, and it is beautiful blue sky. It's like the 3rd straight day of it. And I'm thinking, this guy is beating it up. He has chosen the most polluted day possible to do this report, to make it look as bad as possible. I could see what people were pissed off about. Here's the thing. 7 years later, I get sent back to Beijing, posted for the ABC. And in late 2015, there was this horrendous run of air pollution. And so we're doing a lot of reporting on it. And I did a piece to camera, which I sent back to the editors, talking about how bad it was. And an editor actually rang me up and said, "Can you wait for a more polluted day to go out and reshoot that? You're doing this story about how terrible the pollution is, and it really doesn't look that bad. How do you expect people here to even care about the story?" So many familiar faces in this crowd, half of them from Beijing. Too many Australian journalists here. Anyway, so I suppose you could say I can see it from both sides. Anyway, so during those years, the idea that the Western media was out to smear China was already a really baked-in assumption. It was mainstream for those who cared. Much of the world's media was already blocked, particularly the Chinese language versions of the New York Times or the BBC. And part of the reason that Xinhua hired me is because the Chinese government had thrown a few $1 billion at these state media outlets in the hope that they could expand their English language presence abroad and they could have more say in the sort of international discourse around China. So in recent years, we've seen this sort of intensifying, I suppose you could call it, battle between, things like the Global Times and Chinese state media online, and of course the more traditional Western media, but it's really not new. This has been going for a long time. And just one little thing I do remember, back when I was at Xinhua, the Chinese government would use this term to justify its censorship, the term fake news, jiaxinwen. So you can imagine what it was like to be back in Beijing in about 2015, 2016, and to see things go full circle when Donald Trump emerged on the scene, to use the exact same term. Now, let's talk a little bit about Australia-China. I came back to Beijing in 2015, and by then the rough edges of the relationship were starting to show, but compared to now, things were still pretty smooth. The mining boom had tapered off, but there was an agribusiness boom. There was an international education boom. There was a tourism boom. Joint military drills between Australia and the Chinese Navy were regular occurrences. I went to some of them. Ministers used to shuffle through Beijing with regularity, some of them careful to avoid the Australian media when they were there. And in hindsight, things were a bit too close for comfort. Here in Australia at the time, the 2 biggest political donors to both parties were 2 Chinese property billionaires, one who has an Australian passport and a private media company in Guangdong, which is a very rare occurrence for a foreigner. The ABC back then had a tie-up with the state-owned Shanghai Media Group, which meant abandoning an independent Chinese language service to instead run a .cn portal in China. It was full of ads for Tourism Australia and Qantas, and it wasn't supposed to have any news on it. But they needed content. So what they used to do is take my stories that I wrote in English, translate them into Chinese, and censor them. It was absolute madness. This was not a good way to do engagement. It did not serve Australia's interests. And thankfully, a couple of years later, under Michelle Guthrie, the ABC later reinstated an independent Chinese language news service and gave it a bit of funding. SBS too has one. So it was kind of hard to imagine back in those glory days, 2010 or even 2015, just how bad things would get between Australia and China. But sitting there watching it in Beijing, it kind of felt to me like there's no way it's going to continue on the path it was on. I always say that ties between Australia and China are sort of like a stock market that has boomed from a really low base. Two countries that frankly had very little to do with each other historically. I mean, there are the Chinese communities for the gold rush and say the Australian journalists like Donald and Morrison who went to China and so forth. But, it's not like the sort of, the kind of cricket pitches of India or say Bali, which, a huge amount of Australians go to on a regular basis. There just isn't actually that much cultural glue. And so, not surprisingly, you had these two countries with not that much to do with each other, which suddenly find they have incredibly complementary economies. But the tricky issues that were all pushed aside during those years, they were always going to come to the fore. China will never feel comfortable about Australia's political and military alliance with the US. Australia will never feel comfortable about China's rivalry with Australia's main ally, or its authoritarian system, or its increasing military buildup. There are many other differences, but it was naive to ever think that they weren't going to become problems. Kind of like a stock market surge, there was always going to be a correction. And that's what we've seen from both sides in the past few years. So I've been asked, how do I see the PRC? What a question. It's so broad. Let me have a sip of water while I contemplate. It's all off the cuff, there's no notes. Well, look, the first thing to say is that I'm a journalist, and journalists are not business people. We don't make money off being nice and sealing deals, nor are we diplomats. It's not our job to make relationships smooth and mutually beneficial. We get paid, in theory, to cut through the bullshit and present what's happening in the most truthful and relevant way possible. But our audience, our editors, our personal experience, our biases all weigh into it. The result being that we don't report in a perfectly nuanced and impartial way. And if we did, if we loaded up every story with caveats to make it as neutral as possible, it would be boring as batshit and you wouldn't read it. Quite a few academics often like to online ship journalists and despair at how unnuanced our reporting can be about China, but we have readers. So I suppose my position as a journalist factors into my view because as some other journalists here tonight in the audience are aware, you really rub up against the rough edges of the Chinese state when you happen to work in that field. So I'd say I see the Chinese state for what it is. It's efficient, it's effective, it's authoritarian, it's ethno-nationalist, and it's determined to put its interests first. By contrast, I suppose you'd describe the Australian state as not particularly efficient, somewhat effective, free and open, multicultural, and at times a bit complacent about putting its interests first. Everybody can debate that if they want, but the effectiveness and the efficiency of China is really well known. It's pretty much the reason why we've had an economic boom for the past 2 decades. Like governments in Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea before it, China's government has been really effective at generating rapid growth by spending, but of course doing it on a huge scale. The constant building and infrastructure programs have achieved tremendous economic results and of course have raised living standards. Sure, there's a lot of waste, there's a lot of debt, and there's a lot of oversupply in the process. But these are problems that Chinese policymakers spend a huge amount of time sitting around thinking about. So I'm of the view we're not going to have some sort of hard landing one day, even though there are obviously problems and you can't just have this sort of golden accelerated growth forever. Ultimately, to sum it up, I'd say it's a country that gets things done. The efficiency was also on display during the pandemic. After bungling the initial outbreak, China's containment efforts were extraordinary. A densely populated country of 1.4 billion people, most of them living in big cities, achieving around about a dozen or so new cases a day, save for the occasional flare-ups. I mean, this is amazing. Now, you get a lot of people online who say, you can't believe the figures, they're lying to you. Those are people on Twitter. They're not usually people in China. I spent the first 9 months of the global pandemic there. I believe the figures are largely correct, the ones we get now. The authoritarian nature of China is familiar probably to everybody here, and the more outrageous examples are pretty obvious. Blocking and banning views and information sources that the party can't control, arresting people for expressing dissenting opinions and sometimes jailing them, outlawing any form of group organisation that the party isn't in charge of, things like independent labour unions or civil society groups with dissenting views. The list goes on. We've seen recent examples at a personal level involving a couple of Australians. One of them, Chung Lei, a state media presenter from Melbourne, was disappeared, locked in a cell and cut off from lawyers, family and the outside world for 6 months while they interrogated her to build a state secrets case. She's sitting tonight, as we do this, still in a Beijing detention centre, still not charged. But living there, you see on a daily basis the smaller things that showcase the party's absolute obsession with controlling others when it comes to its interests. Banning tattoos on television, banning celebrity gossip sites for promoting bad values and bad morals, banning foreigners or ethnic minorities from speaking dialects, well, banning foreigners or separately ethnic minorities from speaking dialects, if it was both, it'd be very impressive, on live streaming platforms. And of course, in the case of Hong Kong, limiting free speech, and there's no other way to say it, destroying the quasi-democracy that the city still had because a huge proportion of Hong Kongers weren't complying with Beijing's wishes. But aside from the state, living there, of course, you're really privileged to see the humour that so many people have about all this, or the cynicism, or the measures they use to get around these restrictions or poke fun at them. Then there's the ethno-nationalism of the Chinese state. Now, long term, this perhaps makes me more uneasy than anything else, because ideas that are being pushed by the state around ethnicity in China today appear to be moving in the opposite directions to ideas about multiculturalism here. With 92% of the population being Han, it's not surprising that ethnicity and nationhood are deeply intertwined in China. And it's kind of a common thing up in Northeast Asia. Western nations, including colonial ones like Australia, are very familiar with these ideas, having implemented discriminatory policies in the past, not to mention the treatment of Indigenous Australians. But in recent decades, Western nations have been moving towards the idea that your ethnicity does not determine your nationality or your political loyalty. And however imperfect efforts have been to embrace immigration and multiculturalism, these concepts are mainstream here. Parties like Pauline Hanson's don't win majorities at federal elections. People have largely embraced these concepts, and this is despite constant debates and discrimination and flare-ups of intolerance. China at the moment is the opposite to all this. As we've seen with the mass internment and re-education programs for ethnic minority Uyghurs, and before them, the surveillance and repression of Tibetans, China's Race Discrimination Commissioner would be really, really busy if there was such a position. When a recent draft policy to make it slightly easier for a very small number of foreigners to apply for permanent residency was put to public consultation, it received such a nasty and xenophobic reaction online that the government withdrew it and promised to revise it. It's this broad us and them idea in China, which I fear fuels the expectation that overseas Chinese will help contribute to the great rejuvenation of the motherland. That's the actual rhetoric. China's government never clearly defines whether overseas Chinese includes Australian citizens of Chinese descent, but it has become standard for Chinese leaders when travelling abroad to be welcomed by patriotic groups of overseas Chinese, symbolically representing the loyalty to the motherland. This concept of war is everywhere in China these days in the state media. With the Communist Party leader Xi Jinping in recent years elevating nationalism to almost a form of like a quasi-state religion. It is just in your face everywhere up there these days. I am concerned that the expectation of political loyalty for Chinese abroad, whether they like it or not, will likely rise. When 3 ethnically Chinese reporters working for US media, including an Australian, were expelled last year for political reasons, I was appalled to see a prominent English language commentator, who is often seen as an international voice on CCTV, sharing articles on his WeChat describing them as Argueza, meaning enemy collaborator. My Chinese colleagues in Beijing from time to time were called traitors for working for the foreign media. These are small things that leave deep impressions, and I'm just an observer. I'm not even affected by this. I feel it puts Chinese Australians or recent migrants between a rock and a hard place, because the flip side, of course, is that bigots in Australia seize on Beijing's expectation of political loyalty to accuse Chinese Australians of disloyalty, or to place extra obligations on them to condemn the communist state, obligations that non-Australian Chinese don't face. So this in turn, when you get people from Australia doing these sorts of things, it helps to kind of fuel one of the Chinese government's main talking points, that criticism of China is simply racism. It's a shit situation for Chinese Australians to be in, and unfortunately one that I really do fear will become more difficult as China becomes more nationalistic and assertive in the coming years. That's the path that it appears to be on. So where does the media fit into all of this? Clearly, both Australia and China have grievances about each other's media. Diplomats in Beijing used to tell me that it was constantly raised in the talking points from Chinese counterparts when they had meetings. I was told there wasn't an expectation in Australia that the government can control the media, but there was an expectation that the government should be publicly pushing back against some of the negative coverage. On the Chinese side, the government does control the media, and through its propaganda agencies, it would continually whack Australia and blame Australia, particularly in its English language Global Times publication, in these past few years. And I would note that a lot of that criticism is in English and primarily targeted at audiences abroad. The impression I had in China is that most people were somewhat less interested in this than people are here. There are, of course, more moderate voices in the Chinese state media who from time to time pick holes in some of the Australian media coverage of China and its constructive criticism. An example was a recent report about a possible $39 billion new industrial city to be built on a remote Papua New Guinean island by a Chinese company. Some media outlets appeared to take this proposal at face value and talked up the national security concerns which appeared to be being pushed by figures in Canberra, rather than emphasising in their reporting just how unlikely this project would be for all sorts of reasons. Clearly, it wouldn't be much of a story if you talk that up. There's also been a fair bit of reporting out of Canberra in recent years that appears to take the word of Australia's security agencies or government sources or even US sources at face value. Things like secret dossiers about Wuhan labs, or databases of Communist Party members, or supposed spies seeking to defect. It's not that these stories shouldn't be done. They should if they have merit. But the sources pushing these stories, their motivations need to be questioned too. And it's not good enough to prepare it all from their perspective, or maybe the perspective of someone at ASPI, and then at the last minute, ring up the Chinese embassy in Canberra and say, hey, have you got any comment? Just to try and balance the story up. We rightfully cast a cynical eye on China's government. Sometimes I feel in journalism here, we could apply similar cynicism to our government when doing these sorts of stories. Take, for example, the situation that the AFR's Mike Smith and I, live in person, found ourselves in late last year when we were evacuated by DFAT from China after the Chinese cops embroiled us in a security investigation. It's pretty clear the only reason why this all happened is because ASIO raided the homes of 4 Chinese state journos here in Sydney, and the Chinese government ultimately advised them to get out. So that context casts things in a bit of a different light. And at no point was it revealed by the Australian side, either publicly or to us. And I'm very glad that it was revealed by the Chinese state media once we were safely home. So what can we do to help ensure that journalism better serves audiences when discussing China? First, let's be honest, let's just acknowledge the Chinese state is really non-transparent. So there's probably always going to be some mistakes and misinterpretations that journalists outside looking in make. But we do need to try to avoid making assumptions. Take, for example, the naivety and parochialism on display during China's trade bans on Australian exports. How often would you hear commentators on ABC radio or in the Oz or in the media generally, they say, gee, they've mishandled the relationship. Oh, Burma, he can't even get his Chinese counterpart to pick up the phone. Can you believe it? His counterpart, Zhongshan, not only refused to pick up the phone and actually chat about China's grievances, he also refused to take questions about this at a farcical press conference in Beijing that I went to. For an hour and a half, we're there with our hands up, as are other journalists who have pre-registered their questions, because you have to in China sometimes. And he's got this assistant kind of pretending that it's a genuine press conference, and he kind of hones in on you, and then he's like, "Xia Yue," and it's somebody from, "Hi, I'm from the Xinhua News Agency. Can you please tell us about the Belt and Road initiatives that are going on in Pakistan?" Hour and a half I sat through this, right? So it wouldn't be Zhongshan's decision anyway to dodge the question. He's at the mercy of the decision makers inside the party's Central Foreign Affairs Commission. So sitting there dealing with this opaqueness and hearing these media commentators back in Sydney and Canberra shift the blame for this non-transparent, non-cooperative, opaque behaviour to the Australian side just struck me as really parochial. It would benefit all news outlets in Australia when reporting on things like this in future if they made Chinese language skills or experience in country a bit more of a priority when hiring new journalists. Not for every position, but perhaps in Canberra, it could be factored in for a couple of positions. Certainly at the ABC, we have a lot of ex-correspondents actually in senior editorial roles. So it's to some degree still happening, but if you have people who speak the language or have been through China for a few years, and even if they don't speak the language, they've seen it for themselves, they experience the restrictions, they experience the perspectives of people on the ground. Do they even care about Australia? What do they think about the Chinese government? That will be very useful to factor in when writing about, say, that Papua New Guinean island. Most China heads thought the idea of Beijing allowing $39 billion to funnel out to build this, tin pot city on a remote island was highly unlikely. At the very least, those with language skills or from a Chinese-Australian background, even if they're here, they can read the domestic discussion in China, which despite the censorship can be really lively and insightful. So over time, it would certainly help if media organisations tried to funnel more of those people, either from Chinese backgrounds or with experience, language skills, into those higher roles, those more important roles. I'll just say though, overall, despite this question about the media, I actually don't really think it's a problem. I think you have sensationalist and poorly informed reporting about a lot of different topics and countries. It's just that China's government is really, really sensitive about it and increasingly assertive about any perceived slight. So just to wrap up, I would just say that the friction that we've seen in recent years, it may get better in the short term because Trump's no longer in power, but it's not going to go away. The same issues are going to continue for quite some time. And I just want to touch on something finally. The difficulties of the Australian media to compete in the Chinese language space here in Australia. I spoke before about the importance of multiculturalism in Australia. The ABC and SBS have put resources towards building Chinese language sites and apps and things like that. It's to serve those in the Australian community who primarily rely on Chinese language. Here's the problem. The Chinese state, through both censorship and protectionism, has funneled an entire population onto one app, WeChat. The others are blocked, WhatsApp, Facebook, etc., Twitter. WeChat has also therefore become the primary distribution channel for news. Everybody from state media to small-time bloggers use it to get their content out there. It's indispensable for first-generation Chinese migrants keeping in touch with friends and family. And that's why the major political parties make such use of it at election time, trying to win Chinese voters. But everything on WeChat is subject to the Chinese Communist Party's censorship, whether by algorithm or human intervention. And therefore, many of the most popular sites and accounts for Chinese language news in Australia on WeChat are being censored by Beijing, even if it's not deliberately, it's just through the system they're in. We're talking about local news for Australians. And a good example being, of course, the recent uproar when a low-level official in China's government posted that picture referencing the Australian SAS war crimes investigation. The news on those Chinese Australian sites for members of the Chinese Australian community who rely on them was all being funneled through the Chinese government censorship guidance. So you might remember that Scott Morrison then used his own WeChat account to try and give his response in Chinese directly to Chinese Australians, free from the spin that Beijing was putting on it, only for WeChat to censor it and delete it. For the ABC and SBS, they can apply for WeChat public accounts, but they can't. They want to get their eyeballs. Sorry, they want to get their content in front of the eyeballs of Chinese Australians. They want to engage more, but they can't run real news accounts on WeChat because of the censorship. It is a real problem to have a foreign government creating a digital ecosystem to control the narrative for some Australians in Australia. China pioneered the decoupling of the internet within its borders, and through WeChat censorship, it's continuing to promote a restricted information world for some Australians here. As Scott Morrison's recent failure to use WeChat to engage on WeChat showed, it really is a mug's game. And I'm hopeful that our political parties will become more aware of that in future.